Kino Mudwin, which means, in Ojibwe, we learn together. Mm-hmm. It's one of the old names for the petroglyphs at Stony Lake as well. And really, it's I named it that as a result of wanting to dedicate it to my spiritual leader and cultural teacher, who taught me a great deal of the history that goes into the program, and it's really becomes the impetus about how we move people emotionally and intellectually, by telling them the history of North America from an Indigenous perspective. So that's where it originally comes from, and my teacher, I should say, for the record as well, his name was Eddie King, and Eddie was the hereditary spiritual leader of the Odawa people and lived most of his later years in his life in Wikwemicong. He passed away last year. But Eddie kept a history that included a history of not just the development of North America prior to European contact and the diversification of its nations and the building of its population. He also kept and had the teachings of the petroglyphs as part of his responsibility as well. So that's sort of the basis of where we start from a historical and educational perspective, in order hopefully to move people to help them find their own path of reconciliation, and hopefully then to encourage and support those people that are motivated from learning more to contribute to whatever reconciliation is. I'm not even sure myself, but well, it's a path that people can learn together. Anyway, there's, as I said, some various offshoots, and the main program that I do is a series of evening talks, about 2 hours each, so 3 in total. So about 6 hours of time together. And in most cases right now, it's with adults who are settlers, who have mostly by word of mouth right now, and with some partnerships with organizations like the National Farmers Union and KAIROS, KAIROS. It's an ecumenical justice initiative. They're people that are already inclined, I think, in terms of being socially or being active from a social perspective, and they are most often already looking for some greater understanding of issues, so that for them to be able to be involved in some way. So typically we partner with local church organizations as well, but typically I'll do these 2-hour pieces in consecutive weeks. For instance, I'm doing one right now on Tuesday evenings in Meaford, but I have been consistently doing these for about 2 years now. And in the context of a group of around 24 as the maximum, there's lots of interest. There's a waiting list every time. So the first 2-hour section is actually more about some Anishinaabe traditional spiritual practices. I lay out my bundle. I explain my bundle. We do a pipe ceremony, and I explain in great detail the traditional and the the teachings around each part of that ceremony, from smudge to pipe, water, food, and that's really, it's the first 2 hours of 6 hours that ultimately, those first two, I think, sets up people to understand that there is a richness of culture that still survives today. And I think puts them in a place where they're willing to listen to more, and sort of then it becomes really the more hard-hitting stuff for the last 2 sessions. The second session, I talk about North America and its development from the last ice age. This is the history that was taught to me by Eddie King, as I mentioned earlier. And it speaks about migrations of people after the last ice age, as the glaciers receded and people moved back into areas like this, and how the original nations of people began to diversify and have national identities of their own. So I talk about that in session 2, and I get really as far, I talk about European contact, and I get in session 2 to the point of just after the large treaties, Canadian treaties, the numbered treaties begin. And I talk with a group about the nature of treaties and what they looked like, what the mindset was for the Indigenous people involved, and what was the mindset for the British and ultimately Canadian government representatives. The last session, the third one, is a continuation of the talk, really starting with the Indian Act and how it dovetailed with the treaties, residential school process that came about, in particular in that time frame, that was linked to the premises of the Indian Act. And then after I kind of whacked them over the head with all that, I take some time and I talk about the progress since the Second World War, and how when you're living it, it doesn't seem like a lot of progress, but when you do kind of step back and look at it more objectively, it really is. So it's a chance to build people back up a little bit, and give them some hope as well, because I wouldn't be doing it if I didn't have hope. And then I have some time at the end for a talking circle, that sort of thing. Gives people, again, an opportunity to ask other questions, or to at least leave that day feeling hopefully more empowered and motivated, as opposed to just feeling guilty, which is, I think I do a pretty good job creating a guilt-free environment. My brother, Paul, and I used to, when we worked for the OPP, I was a police officer for many years, and we worked in our First Nations policing section. That was the name of the day. We developed and led a week-long, a five-day course for a lot of different service providers, not just police officers. So this history talk comes really, it used to be a part of that bigger picture. And for a lot of people that come to the talk as I'm doing it now, it creates relationships, not just for me and co-workers at the Friendship Center, but amongst their group as well, because they come from a variety, as I said, mainly they're social activists. So it's a relationship builder in that sense as well. Essentially, in many ways, it's a lecture format, but when it's in a circle and the medicines are around and in front of you and so on, it's not the same, of course, as sitting in a classroom in rows. Mm-hmm. More interactive than that.
Sounds fantastic.
So there are youth parts of this as well. Mm-hmm. You'll want to check, and I say it now because I'll forget. Our Friendship Center has a strong partnership with an organization in Collingwood called Elephant Thoughts Educational Outreach. And we do, Elephant Thoughts does a variety of things abroad, internationally, but its bread and butter really is work that they do, the First Nations in Northwest Territories, in Northern Ontario, and in particular with the Cree School Board of the east side of James Bay, headquartered in Mysticity. And some of the things that we partner with them right now is we developed it's not really a DVD anymore, but it's a computer-based interactive program for sort of middle school children. So anywhere from grades 5 through, I think they've tested it on even grades 11. And they're going out into the schools around Collingwood, Meaford, and Thornbury right now, and working with teachers to try it out. And our Friendship Center worked with them on the development of the materials. I wrote script. I did a little bit of, I did voiceovers and some other things as well, amongst a lot of other people. So I think that video is likely a good example of best practices. And in terms of the educational things I talked about that I was doing with adults, we have a program at a farm owned by Elephant Thoughts that I work with their coordinator there for working with high school kids, and it's less history and more teachings about relationships. So I'll tell stories and give traditional teachings around anger management, how we are supposed to act in relationships with our family, with our friends, with people who we're potentially interested in dating. So I do that as a complement to some of the land-based things that they do at this farm called Kimbercoat as well. So it's, for me anyway, I look at it as sort of a setting the record straight, helping people understand that the history that they learned in school, that I learned in school, bears very little resemblance to reality. I make that point in the context of my talk, unfortunately, by quoting Napoleon. But Napoleon said that history is a set of lies agreed upon. His conquerors write history. So that seems to be that point of the program is often a sort of a catharsis, probably the first catharsis point around the fact that I paint North America as a very vibrant socioeconomic dynamic prior to European settlement, people trading and moving around mostly on the rivers and the lakes, and I ultimately make the point that it was very much the same as what was happening in Europe at the same time in the mid-1400s. So that's where I can make the point finally that we were not in North America just a small group of savage people that happened to live on an incredible set of natural resources that were just waiting to be reaped. That there were millions and millions of people here and living life in a very similar way than what was going on in Europe at the time. So I think, I think it's the first of all, according to the course assessments that I've seen, and they're anecdotal. That I joked earlier, it was a guilt-free environment, but part of what makes it effective is that I do set people up to a place where they feel safe that I'm going to treat the material with a degree of measure and forethought, that I'm not there to bash heads and draw battle lines, and I really and so that they have an opportunity to both freely consider, I guess, without guilt, what I have to say, and that they feel free and empowered to ask questions and challenge me. So I think that's a really big part in sort of any program that we're going to do, even though it's harder to do when we are talking about materials that are more about sort of textbooks and those sorts of things. And to that point, one of the things that I think makes what we do effective is that it is still a face-to-face sort of, it's an interaction. And I've had lots of people and organizations that are actively right now asking about whether or not I would record my history talk in a webinar format. And I'm getting older now, so I mean, I'm going to have to give in at some point. But I won't agree to do it for the part where I'm talking about medicines and traditional teachings. I'll likely give in on the history part. But there is something that is more far-reaching by having interaction as opposed to watching a video. It works well too that the format in which I deliver it is has a lot of discussion about the. I'm sorry. Mm-hmm. Bear with me for a minute. About sort of the circumstances under which the treaties came to be negotiated. That it's there's a lot. I mean, it's about what was going on at the time. There's a lot of background information about why treaties looked the way they did, why they weren't well executed, in particular in the beginning, and what the end goals were for the signatories to the treaty. Those things help sort of people put in context that, in particular, I think, and it's important, that not everything that went on was nefarious, insidious. There were, especially at the frontline level where people were interacting and trying to live in proximity to each other, that a lot of the things that happened there were good things. And like many things, when a government thinks that they know better than about what needs to be done than the people that are actually living the experience, things start to go awry. And that's certainly a part of our history in Canada. I guess when you talked about reconciliation earlier, those are still difficult topics, even in particular for Indigenous people, many of whom don't have a strong sense themselves of sort of how things got to be so bad. And it's hard to define, I guess. And one of the things that we do in our final circle is encourage people at least to think about the skills they have. Because lots of people ask me, well, what can I do? And I can tell them, some things up front. My talks are normally, when I go out in the community, they're free, but we accept donations. And I tell people that for the most part, it's going to go to food security, because our Indigenous clients in the Owen Sound area, like many others, it's a really difficult journey to help bring them to a point of a much healthier way of life when they are so poor that many days they don't know when what they're going to have to eat. So I'll ask people to make those kinds of contributions to our center for for food security initiatives. But I think we've come to the general understanding that reconciliation for settlers, anyway, is often based. It is often based on the skills and the abilities that they already have. Try to work them through a thought process where they can figure out for themselves, because I don't have time to figure out for everyone that I speak to. They can figure out for themselves what they can do based on the skills that they have to establish some greater relationship or contribution, and what that looks like. I used to do the sort of content of the talk that I'm doing now, mainly for First Nations organizations and people, and my life has changed for some things that are beyond my control and so on. And I would want occasionally. I don't anymore, but even 5 years ago, I think, am I telling this story to the right audience? My teacher was still alive then, although health-wise, he wasn't great. But I talked to him about it, and he said, "Yeah, I think this is what you're supposed to be doing." Though it still pains me once in a while to think that there's an audience out there for my history talk that I'm not reaching, and I feel badly about it. But I think this is my reconciliation. But I think there's a lot of Indigenous people. You hear them talk, and even if they're not articulating it exactly, they aren't ready for reconciliation. They're not sure what it means, but they know that there's enough bad history that it's not something that they jump in gleefully with both feet on. I've been taken by how it's ongoing popularity, and I'll do it sometimes in smaller pieces depending on what the audience is. Doesn't always. I can do a 2-hour talk without the medicines being laid out. I can do a 2-hour history talk. I think is still effective. But anything less than that, you just create confusion or anxiety. If you can't send people away feeling whole, at least, then you're in danger of, I think, misleading people. There is a man by the name of Gary Kenny who lives west of here, and he is a local president for the National Farmers Union. And he came, I don't know how exactly, to hear me talk at my work when I was running one of these 3-week programs. And since then, he has sort of taken on the administrative responsibility. So he's connected with Owen Sound and in Hanover, where I've run talks, and in Meaford, as I mentioned. I'm doing Meaford this week. Alliston, I've done a couple of series there as well, all originally from sort of Gary's organizing these groups and dealing with setting up classrooms and getting a location and stuff. It takes a lot of pressure off me. So I mentioned it because he's the one who is usually getting the feedback from my talk. So I've seen lots of emails from people that he's forwarded to me talking about how they enjoyed it, what their assessment was, and so on. So we've done some tweaking as a result of sort of the feedback that he's gotten, but it's been generally very positive. Again, as I mentioned earlier, around the environment that's been created, sort of the guilt-free environment, and about the sort of easy, the path that it's easy. I tell a story that's easy to follow, or relatively easy, given the complexity of the topic. So it's mainly through that. Indigenous education is more of a backdrop. It's more of a foundation, which all learning comes from. So it depends on the topic in some ways, but I mean, it's mostly an environment where Indigenous perspectives, skills, Indigenous history, whatever, it's an environment in which those things are accepted as part of the growing continuum of whatever education is in Canada. In the big picture, when we talk about reconciliation, and Indigenous education is part of it as well, it has to be understood and explored from a perspective where people are taking ownership of the historic relationship between Canada and Indigenous people. So, I got a story of my life, and some of it isn't very pretty, because I've been fighting a mental illness for many years. Sometimes fighting it well, and sometimes not so well. And I used to try to cover it up. Certainly didn't talk about it in public, but ultimately, I discovered that my life was a lot more productive and a lot more fun when I just took ownership of my own life and of my own history. So when you can take ownership and take hold, you can move forward from a place of much greater peace and much greater focus. So to that end, we as Canadians, all of us, need to do that as well. We need to take ownership of our history. And I'm not talking about an apology from the Prime Minister or those sorts of things. I'm talking about all of us as Canadians saying, yeah, this happened, and we're going to move forward from it, understanding the impact that it's had. So any sort of Indigenous education initiative ultimately we have to come from that place. So Indigenous education is likely going to get us to that place, hopefully, where we are, where as a society, Canadians are accepting of the mistakes that have been made in the past. Because I don't think they are yet. Indigenous education has, I think, various phases. But one of the first ones has to be certainly a recording and a process by which people come to terms with. 10 years ago, there wouldn't have been interest at all. We need some continuity for sure. So you mentioned earlier that the ministry in Ontario, Ministry of Education, is working at developing curriculum and so on. That's important work. I'm not convinced yet that I just don't know. It sort of remains to be seen. And this process makes sense to me that you're talking about, because we do find pockets in Ontario, school boards as an example. It might be a children's aid society somewhere else, but there are places in Ontario, some of them completely unpredictably, where organizations that are supposed to be serving Indigenous people or dealing with Indigenous issues are doing a great job of it, or as best they can. They're way out in front of others. But we need it to be. We need to find that the best practices and work with the right partners to build up that momentum and ultimately to have some sort of consistent application with respect to education, social services, whatever it might be. So that would be a great goal for 10 years. It may take longer than that because I've been saying the same things about what we're talking about now since the mid-90s. And when some of the people that support me in what I do, like this fellow Gary Kenny that I mentioned, said, well, we've got to, you've got to stop what you're doing, anything but this, and let a bunch of us, support you to take this show on the road and travel lots of places and do it and that sort of thing. And I've done that, some of that historically, but I'm just, again, it's one person. And for me anyway, especially at this time in my life, to be in this area and having a very positive effect on a number of people around the issues is plenty. I mean, we do have to think broadly as well, but at the same time, it's important still to have sort of local resources, whoever they may be, doing their thing, because those are the relationships that are created that actually help people day to day. So my point being, it's the decisions that we'll make about how broadly we develop certain things. We always have to be cognizant that there is a natural point in terms of how big a project or how small a project we're working on. There is a place where it's naturally effective. So there's some danger too as we try to look the biggest picture possible, that we might miss the mark because there's not an interactive or sort of personal piece in the program we're delivering that builds the relationships between people. It's a pretty, it's very low cost, as I said, but I know it would be great to have a protege, and I've worked to, I have people that come out of the woodwork once in a while that aren't willing to take ultimately the biggest step they need in order to ultimately sort of be able to deliver something similar on their own. The webinar format is something that I'm still interested in doing. And that would be really just a one-timer of really high quality recording with the people that have the skills to do that. Something that would be good enough that you could play it on a screen in a room like this, and people would still get a great deal out of. And we have some irons in the fire around that, but nothing concrete so far. Yeah, so having access to that kind of equipment and those kinds of people with those production values. Mm-hmm. I guess the other piece, though, I mentioned is that although I've written a paper many years ago on the history that I talked about, it was in 2003. When I read it now, it sounds just like me when I was that age. Why not, right? Of course it does. But yeah, I find the other thing that I need is I do have to record it somehow. The history, I'm not talking the recording of me doing a lecture that people can look at and get something out of it. Just I need to be recorded properly for historical reasons, because the history that I talk about is one that's not well known. And after Eddie, I only know 3 people that know the history, and his knowledge of the petroglyphs was complete. I know that he did work with a couple of the Vostokis professors at Trent, and I don't. Eddie didn't live long enough to teach me all of it for sure. But the history of the petroglyphs, I believe too, is very important. And there's almost no one left that knows all the legends. 1,927 legends. Eddie said the petroglyphs. And he knew them all. The teachings about medicines are, lots of people know them that I teach in a small group, but I think there is some again, just the way I present it, people are feeling very welcome, and it's a detailed enough description, like smudging as an example. It's about 45 minutes of explanation, because it's important, people, at least from my perspective, for people to understand what the goals were historically when people smudged. So, to your question, that's something that I'd be happy to sit down and just do for someone from your core group or whatever, just because I think I have some unique perspectives and some detail that most other facilitators don't talk about, or maybe cannot. So the first 2-hour talk that I do is around the medicines. I have issues around like bringing the camera in, because they're old traditions. The history talks, the other 2 sessions, I don't have that at all. But it may be worthwhile. It may be worthwhile for you guys to record it.